And we are live, Robert.
All right, here we are. Second time that we're doing this live stream here from Tel Aviv, Israel. Greetings to you all. My name is Robert Sherman. I cover foreign affairs here at NewsNation. And today we're going to be taking any questions that you all might be having that's currently ongoing in the Middle East. I know it's been a busy news day today, whether it was the Diddy trial that many around the globe were glued to, or whether it was this Brian Koberger guilty plea that we all just heard from a short while ago. But of course, there's still the whole situation here with the Middle East as well that we're all navigating here. So I'll wait for a few more people to hop on before we really start to dive into all of this here. But if you have any questions, feel free to throw them into the chat here. So we wait for a couple of people to join. Okay, as we want to kick this off here, once again, my name is Robert Sherman. I cover foreign affairs here at NewsNation. And what a time to be out here in the Middle East right now. As someone said it so perfectly the other day, an idiom that people sometimes use here that I think that is worth sharing with you all. When the winds change in the Middle East, you feel it. And it certainly feels as though we are living in a completely different time here in this region right now. Everything feels different. Everything feels significant and highly consequential as we look at the way that Iran and Israel have this ceasefire that for now appears to still be holding after they just wrapped up the so-called 12-day war that they fought here. But you also have the possibility of ceasefires and negotiations taking place in Gaza. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is going to be on his way to the White House on Monday in order to pick up those conversations. The back channels from everyone we've heard from is very active right now. And things feel so different here from the standpoint that it seems as though that we are on the precipice of some potential movement here in the region. War has been ongoing here for 20 months. It has been so constant and it has occupied headlines on a day-to-day basis to a point that it almost feels normal. And you know how wrong that is to say that war can feel normal in any circumstance, but it has become just such a daily occurrence here ever since October 7th and become just a part of the day-to-day coming out of the region here to see this situation that is ongoing between Israel and Hamas that we all have to navigate here. That it is, it has seemed as though that it's just become a part of day-to-day life. But what we're looking at right now is a moment in time in which it seems as though that there are cogs that are spinning in the background here, that there are negotiations that are taking place in which we might see, at the very least, the beginning, the initial steps of the sunsetting of this war that is currently ongoing in Gaza. You have all of this pressure that is on the ground here in Israel right now in order to cut a deal, any deal, in order to get the hostages, the few who are still alive, out of Gaza. Right now, the best estimates that there are about 50 hostages currently being held inside of Gaza, but about 20 of them are alive. Time of the essence is what we hear again and again from all these hostage families. On the other hand, you have the international community, which for well over a year has been talking about the humanitarian situation inside of Gaza. But now you see humanitarian efforts really being led by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is US run group. And so you see it's the United States is organization that is really taking the lead on all of this up to this juncture in order to try and bolster the humanitarian situation that is inside of Gaza. And then you also have this whole dynamic that is currently taking place here between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump. And you see at times, remaining on friendly terms here up to this juncture. You saw the way the United States just carried out this operation on nuclear facilities in Iran, something that was certainly by many accounts here, unprecedented in order to see an operation like that carried out here. A s Is certainly a testament to the strength of the alliance that the United States and Israel have. But on the other hand, there's a bigger question here: is that did that choice, in order for the United States to be involved here, did that come with strings attached? Is there an expectation now for Israel to potentially wind down the war in Gaza? Because let's be clear here, the president has talked about this on the campaign trail. This is a campaign trail promise: is ending the war in Gaza, bringing an end to the fighting that is taking place inside of the Gaza Strip, bringing an end to the suffering of everyday people in Gaza, which no one is arguing it is not happening at this point, but also try and find some way in order to end this on terms in which there's stability in the region. And I think that that's the big thing that we're all going to have to talk about here as we try and get this second stream set up here. The big thing to talk about here is exactly what does victory look like here in the region, or what does a conclusion look like here in the region? I think that's going to be the big thing that a lot of people are going to ultimately be talking about here, because Israel has said from the very beginning that there are very firm terms in which they would need in order to have a situation in which the war in Gaza would come to an end by their own choice. One is the release of all hostages inside of the Gaza Strip. There has been no movement on that from Israel. That is the non-starter of all non-starters, is all of the hostages need to come out of Gaza. But then there's this second element to talk about here, in which you have consistently heard the Israeli government frame the second objective of the war as the destruction, the defeat of Hamas, and the reestablishment of security in the region here. That's where things are going to get interesting. Is there any malleability on the definitions of those terms there? And I want you to consider this for a moment. So Israel talks about the idea that Hamas needs to be totally defeated in order for them to leave the Gaza Strip. This is something that is talked about often in Israel. Can you totally defeat a group like Hamas? Can you completely annihilate not just a movement, not just what is viewed as a political party inside of Gaza, but an ideology as well? Think back to 1945, for example, when Allied forces defeated Nazi Germany. Did Nazism die in 1945? No, certainly did not, because you can't necessarily kill an idea. So that is where this has been a discussion in Israel, effectively since October 7th, is how realistic is the total destruction of Hamas? Can you really destroy an ideology? There are a lot of Israelis today, 20 months into war, who would say, maybe you can't necessarily. Okay, so what does defeat of Hamas look like? Does that mean Hamas is unable to threaten the populace ever again? Many Israelis would say that that is an important element here. And then there's the big one: Hamas retaining control over the Gaza Strip. That has been an articulated non-starter since the beginning of the war, that Hamas is not allowed to maintain and exert control inside the Gaza Strip once this war is over. That is where you might be seeing a change in sentiment on the ground here, that some might be contending that there is a scenario, that there is a situation in which Hamas could continue to exert control inside of the Gaza Strip, that they could continue to be this ruling party, this taking on this leadership role, both in a military and a political stance, if it's handcuffed in a way, if it has been impaired in a way that it truly cannot carry out legitimate threats against the Israeli population. You have seen the attacks coming from Gaza greatly diminish since the early days of the war. I remember standing out here on October 8th, October 9th, October 10th, in which you would see rocket volley after rocket volley that would be fired not just into southern Israel, which is not outside the norm historically, but these long range rocket capabilities that would reach us in Tel Aviv. or other parts of central Israel. You really haven't seen that happening much at all over the last couple of months here. So Hamas's capabilities have certainly been diminished. Does not mean that they have been eliminated. We saw rocket fire coming from the Gaza Strip just a couple of days ago here. So total threats have not been eliminated here. The point being is that now that we've established that there is a spectrum here, that we've eliminated some of these absolutist terms and these goalposts as to what the end of the war would look like, is there malleability? Is there flexibility from the Israeli side of what terms they would accept in order to wind down the war? And I think that's what we're going to find in the next couple of days. Can tell you this, there is a lot of pressure that is on the ground here in Israel for there to be some pathway towards the end of a war. Because right now it doesn't look as though there's a pathway towards the end of the war. There are comparisons being made in the Israeli public to Vietnam in the way that it feels as though that a war has been entered and there is no natural segue out of it. It seems as though that it's never ending. There are op-eds being written in local papers here in Israel who are making the case that what has not been achieved in these 20 months of war will not be achieved within another 20 months of war. These are conversations that Israelis are having throughout every level of society here, in the restaurants, in the cafeterias. This is what people are talking about because this consumes, everyday conversation here. So that's what we're going to find out in the coming days here, is what exactly is all of this going to look like and what kind of appetite does the Israeli public have in order to cut some kind of a deal here. The prime minister is going to be in Washington, D.C. on Monday, where he'll be meeting with President Trump. President Trump has made very clear in the last couple of days, whether it's on his Truth Social accounts or whether it's in comments that he's made to reporters, he wants a deal on Gaza. He wants a ceasefire, and he wants the war to begin to wind down. He wants a deal that is going to lead to that. And he's said it very publicly to the prime minister that he wants the Israelis to agree to a deal, that would allow for that. The president coming out in the last 24 hours saying Israel has effectively agreed to a deal that would lead to a 60-day ceasefire. But here's what you have seen time and time again throughout these negotiating processes, is that one side agrees to the terms of a deal, and then they come back, then the other side comes in to negotiate the terms, and there is some gap that cannot be bridged, and everything falls apart. We have seen this movie again and again and again. The gap that has been so difficult to bridge up to this point is the one that looks like it might be bridged this go around, just based upon the change of sentiments in Israel. And that is the status of Hamas on the other side of the war. Israel's position has been Hamas cannot be allowed to survive, to rule, to govern on the other side of the war. Basically, it is the annihilation of Hamas is the non-starter for the war to end here. It seems as though that appetite is changing in Israel, that maybe there are certain contexts in which they would allow Hamas to exist in Gaza. The reason for that being there are some in Israel who are believing it is becoming less and less realistic, the total annihilation, the total elimination of Hamas as an entity, as a political party, however you want to file them under, whatever umbrella you want to put them under. There is a growing consensus in the Israeli community that quite possibly on the other side of this war, Hamas is still going to be in Gaza, and they're still more or less going to be calling the shots inside of the enclave. So that is something that people in Israel are starting to come to terms with a little bit more. There is, of course, the conversation about the humanitarian concerns inside of the Gaza Strip and the humanitarian efforts that are being made there. I remember this would have been about a year ago that we went down to the Kerem Shalom crossing as Israel was transiting humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip. And it's every day dealing with that story. It is the big game of he said, she said, where the aid groups say that the Israelis are not allowing the aid in. The Israelis are saying that they are allowing the aid in, but the aid groups are not doing a good enough job of transiting it or picking it up or moving it where it needs to go throughout the Gaza Strip. Point being is that in many cases, there are a lot of people who are not getting the aid that they need for one reason or another. And I remember being down at the Kerem Shalom crossing and speaking with the leaders of Kogat, which is the aid service, of the Israeli military, and looking this colonel with the IDF, in the eyes and asking him, "Do you believe that there is a humanitarian situation, that there is a humanitarian crisis inside Gaza?" And that colonel looked me in the eyes and said, "No, I believe that that is a fabrication." Well, fast forward to today, the United States has made very clear, even under this administration, different administration, different set of pressures in the United States, has made clear that they do believe that there is a very legitimate humanitarian crisis inside of Gaza. We've heard the president talk about how he does not like the images of suffering that are coming out of Gaza. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which has come under fire and takes a lot of criticism from the international community, which we can unpack a little bit later. Point being, they are American led. We spoke with them this week. It is their position that there is a dire humanitarian situation inside of Gaza. There is a food shortage issue of point blank, it not getting into the hands of the hungry, those who need it most, that needs to be solved. And if it's not solved, more people will die from famine, from starvation, etc. That is the position of the United States. That is a position of aid groups that have the backing of the United States, that are led by Americans, that are operating inside of the Gaza Strip. So right there, you see a distinction in thought between the Israeli perspective that we have heard many times on this, as well as now the present day American perspective. The U.S. position is that there is a humanitarian situation inside of Gaza. So rectifying that is going to be an important element to all of this as well. And you hear it continuing to grow from the international community that there are these grave concerns about what is going on inside of Gaza, concerns that have existed pretty much since the beginning of the war, but have now since been amplified in recent months here. That is an element to all of this that is going to have to be addressed, and which is why you are also seeing a bit more pressure being placed here in order to get some kind of a deal done. So that's really what we're looking up here. Um, it's going to be an important element of all of this, to see exactly how the United States addresses that, how they address the international community's concerns, and then how they move forward here. Because then the big conversation becomes what happens the day after Gaza, and the rebuilding process that is going to have to take place in Gaza in order to not just physically rebuild it, but reintroduce it into the international community with the devastation that has taken place inside of the enclave. That is another conversation that the international community is going to have. I do see one question that has come in here. Why won't Benjamin Netanyahu step down? There's a few different elements to all of this. One, the prime minister has absolutely no indication of stepping down as long as the war exists. And there's long-standing philosophies, that when you look throughout history, is that when you're in the midst of a war, maybe it doesn't make sense to change horses midstream, sticking with the same current leadership here. The British did not opt for that in World War II when Winston Churchill ended up losing his election and ended up having to leave the position of prime minister towards the end of the war there. But by and large, there is a philosophy here is that you don't change leadership in the midst of a war. So that's why you haven't seen elections called here as well. Then there's the other element as well, is that the prime minister does still have backing here in Israel. Largely, you have a three-party system in Israel, so you don't need a 51% majority necessarily. The prime minister has a robust coalition on his side of the political spectrum here in Israel. And he still has the backing of many of those people as well. So for the time being, he doesn't need that changeover or anything of the kind. And then there's also the philosophy of finishing what you started, right? There is Since October 8th, there have been calls for accountability in Israel for what happened on October 7th. And for a deeper understanding of what went wrong on October 7th, why this wasn't foreseen, how the government could have allowed something such as this to happen, and in order to ensure that it does not happen again. And there is a widespread belief that there is a day of accountability that is coming in Israel. That day will come once the war is over here. Now, that being said, public sentiment has changed since October 7th. If you held elections in Israel on October 8th, 2023, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his government would have lost pretty handily. Since then, you have seen the destruction of Hezbollah in Lebanon with uncannily sophisticated maneuvers such as the beeper maneuver. You have seen Israel go toe-to-toe in a war with Iran in which they unquestionably bested Iran. The way that they established aerial superiority, the way that they knocked out ballistic missile sites at will, the way that they devastated nuclear capabilities, to what extent, we can have that debate as well, significantly knocked back Iran's nuclear capabilities. No one is really questioning that 20,000-foot view here. So in the last year and a half, there have been some pretty major achievements that have been had by the Israeli military and, de facto, this prime minister here, which has certainly bolstered his credibility to lead during a trying situation and has bolstered his approval ratings here. So it would not be a clear-cut election necessarily if Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu would lose an election here. And I think that that's an important element to understand, is that a lot has happened since October 8th. There's a political ecosystem here in Israel that is not clear cut. There are political divides in this country. On October 6th, there were very major political debates and political demonstrations that were taking place in Israel over the judicial system here. There were riots and there were demonstrations that were taking place here in Tel Aviv, all the way up to the moment of October 7th that was truly dividing the country. A lot has happened since October 7th here. And there will certainly be conversations about accountability here in Israel, but it's not a clear-cut picture as to exactly where Israel goes from here when it comes to leadership. Almost surely there's going to be elections. The outcome of those elections is a bit murkier than they may have been, let's say, a year and a half ago. This here.
Hey, Robert,
See.
here's a question from the
Mhm.
chat.
Yes.
People are wondering on how the bomb shelters and alert systems work.
Yeah. So there's a few different elements with all of that here. So starting off with the bomb shelters, just about every home that is built in Israel is built with a bomb shelter in it. I mean, like every piece of new construction that you see here, a house is not going to go up here, an apartment complex is not going to go up here without bomb shelters built inside of it. A strange concept for us in the United States, in which people would look at you as if you were crazy if you built your home with a bomb shelter in it. People would look at you as crazy if you didn't build your home with a bomb shelter in it. The hotels that are around here, many of them have bomb shelters on every single floor. And they're usually have thick steel doors, reinforced concrete walls in order to protect you as much as possible. Would they protect you from a direct hit from a ballistic missile? Maybe, maybe not. But from the spray of shrapnel, or whether from reverberating blasts that may have come from it, they do a pretty good job of protecting you here. In terms of the alerts, every person here in Israel has apps on their cell phones that will alert them if an alert is triggered in the area that they are in, or anywhere in Israel for that matter. That your phone will start ringing like crazy. It happens to us all the time. And I mean, you'll see it. I mean, everyone gets the exact same alerts in the country. They're kind of like Amber Alerts that you would see. It's like that same blaring sound, that same buzz that comes across on your phone. And I mean, you'll see it. I mean, everyone gets them simultaneously. Everyone looks at their phone and it tells them, that your area is coming under fire, and that you need to seek shelter immediately. So that gives you a few minutes heads up in a place such as Tel Aviv, for example. Then the sirens go off a few minutes later, which gives you maybe 90 seconds, 2 minutes from the time until impact of that rocket or missile. So you get 90 seconds to 2 minutes up here. And then your phone will alert you when the alert for the area has been lifted, when you can come out of the bomb shelters and when you can go about your day as normal. So that's how the alert systems typically work here. Now, that being said, that's Tel Aviv, that's central Israel. If you look at a map, um, there's a decent amount of land, that separates the north and the south here. So let's just say that you're in one of those communities, one of the towns, villages, kibbutzim that directly borders Gaza or directly borders Lebanon. Well, if a rocket or a missile comes from Gaza or Lebanon, your time to impact is significantly shortened. There are places that our team has been in which you get about 5 seconds. And in those cases, reaching a bomb shelter is not even realistic. I mean, there was one time that we were down in southern Israel, and the official guidance from the Israeli military is if the sirens went off, get on the ground and pray. That was the official guidance from the Israeli military because you only had 5 seconds. So I mean, you're not getting to a bomb shelter in that time period. And I mean, the only hope that you have is that you're on the ground and that missile or that rocket does not hit you. That's what the situation is like. And pop shots are very real in that part of the country, in which you get just a couple of seconds that can really change the whole dynamic there. So that's why you have to be alert at all times. And you think about it, I mean, there are times in which people are sleeping and this happens here, so I mean, that's the dynamic that exists there. That's kind of how the alert systems work here in Israel. And you see similar setups in other countries around the Middle East as well. I mean, we were just in Jordan a couple of weeks ago, and when these Iranian missiles were crossing into Jordanian airspace, sirens would go off in Jordan. So I mean, this is just something that is part of the region here, that you have all these defense systems, and you have the bomb shelters, and you have the alerts, and you have the sirens. It's something that is rather common here in this region. Here's an interesting one. So, is there a reason that other Arab nations don't seem to be willing to take Gaza and Palestinian residents temporarily or permanently? That is a really good question, and it's multiple layers. So, there's the political element to all of this. What you hear the leadership in Jordan and the leadership in Egypt say very publicly is that they do not want to be responsible for large scale displacement of Palestinians. The fear being is that if these Palestinians were to be removed from Gaza and they went to Jordan in large numbers, there are a lot of Palestinians that live in Jordan present day. But if you had this additional large number of Palestinians that went to Jordan, or large number of Palestinians that went to Egypt, they would not be able to return to the Palestinian territories. That is a huge concern that many of these countries have because they want the Palestinian people to have the right of return. That is a major issue when it comes to Palestinians and their place here in the region. And it's a major political issue that is here. Then there is the sovereign security element here, which a lot of countries don't publicly acknowledge, but is very realistic, is the destabilizing factor of large numbers of people who would be entering these regions here. For example, I mean, Egypt has put in such an effort over the last couple of years under President al-Sisi to really rebuild and regrow Egypt. And if you've never been to Cairo, it's probably never been a better time to go to Cairo, as they've been investing heavily in the city to make it more of a tourist destination. They've been putting all this money into public works and to museums. And there's been a big focus on rooting out terrorism inside of Egypt as well, particularly in the Sinai Peninsula. That's where many of the terrorist operations have historically been in Egypt. There is fear that large numbers of people from the Palestinian territories moving into their country would inevitably, just purely from law of numbers alone, lead to the influx of those who wish to cause harm or those who wish to participate in terrorism into their countries here, purely from law of numbers. Just based upon the fact that Hamas is viewed as a foreign terrorist organization by just about every country in the Western world. By definition, Hamas members who might be viewed in the Palestinian territories as a political party or a government would be viewed as terrorist organizations moving into these countries here. It just totally depends, which lens you choose to look at this through. So those are the two layers to all of this. What people say publicly is that they want to ensure the right of Palestinians' ability to return to these Palestinian territories. Underneath all of that is a national security concern. And additionally, you're talking about quite literally millions of people potentially, just from Gaza alone moving into these countries as well. That is a huge infrastructure requirement. That is a huge investment. That will certainly, have a drain on public funds and tax dollars that is in these countries as well. So, there's a lot of different layers to all of this. Those latter ones that I mentioned, those are the ones that aren't necessarily mentioned publicly by these governments, but are very much so real. So it is the layer of what's going on behind the scenes and what is going on publicly that a lot of these countries talk about. But I think it's a very good question, and it's something that you're certainly going to hear President Trump talk about more as they talk about the rebuilding of Gaza. He even said this when Prime Minister Netanyahu came and visited the White House earlier this year. He talked about temporarily moving people out of Gaza, considering how dangerous it would be for people to be inside of the enclave while all of this is going on here. So that's something you're going to hear a lot more about, point blank, I think, in the coming months, particularly when we get to the other side of this war, which, if you're just joining us here, we started this off talking about how it feels as though that we're in a very, very different time here in the Middle East. And it seems as though that there are a lot of makings and there are a lot of variables that are in the right position now, in which a ceasefire in the coming days, coming weeks, seems like a much more realistic possibility than it may have been, say, a year ago from now. But when we get to the other side of this war, and when we talk about the rebuilding of Gaza, this is something you are going to be hearing about: the removal of people from the Gaza Strip, which is point blank fundamentally going to be a highly controversial topic that is discussed here. But it is going to be something that comes up, and it is going to be something that is debated here in the region. And it's going to be a broader conversation and a broader argument to be had here. So I think that's a really good question. It's something that you're going to hear a lot more about. I'm worried about Jerusalem. Is it a main target? Historically, actually, Jerusalem is not a major target for missile or rocket attacks. You look at the maps of where these strikes typically take place, or these targeted attacks take place. It's mainly Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is really viewed as the epicenter of what is indisputably Israel. And I say that based upon the view of other countries in the region. Jerusalem is part of Israel as well, but Tel Aviv is viewed as this epicenter, that Iran looks at, or Palestine. Let's just say Hamas looks at. This is viewed as the epicenter of Israeli culture here. So this is why Tel Aviv is always targeted. But you also have a lot of headquarters of intelligence agencies and military sites, that are here as well. So Tel Aviv always gets targeted. Many of these towns and kibbutzim in the south often get targeted. Oftentimes that's because of their proximity. The Negev desert gets targeted because there's a lot of military sites and bases that are there. Northern Israel will get targeted. Jerusalem doesn't, because it is viewed as this religious epicenter. I mean, it plays such a critical role in so many different faiths, a central position in so many different faiths. So oftentimes, for fear of striking a religious or holy site that should not be struck, you don't see the attacks on Jerusalem as often. Now, sometimes you will see one-off suicide bomber attacks that take place in Jerusalem, and there's more of a tendency for that to happen in Jerusalem than, say, Tel Aviv. But typically, you don't see, targeted strikes on Jerusalem nearly to the extent that you see in a place such as Tel Aviv here. Yeah, so I mean that would be my answer to that question there.
Hey, here's another one from the chat.
Mhm.
Is Israel still considered in a quote-unquote war with Iran? And how are they able to fight two at the same time?
That's a really good question. That's a really good question, and it totally depends on who you ask here. You know, the term ceasefire is such a difficult term to unpack because it means different things to different people. Giving you an example, from the Israeli perspective, there was a ceasefire in place with Hamas on October 6th, a ceasefire that was broken by Hamas. That is the Israeli position. Ceasefires can exist for years, ceasefires can exist for hours. Technically speaking, it is a ceasefire between Iran and Israel. From the president's point of view, this has been wound down in a way in which this war, the so-called 12-day war, according to the president, is over. But there is a state of ever vigilance that the Israelis are going to have with Iran. Now, here's another element to all of this between Israel and Iran. The ceasefire that is in place right now impacts Iran, but it does not impact any of these Iranian proxies. And the one that comes to mind the most is the Houthis in Yemen, who are still standing and just carried out a ballistic missile attack on Israel yesterday that sent people here in central Israel running to bomb shelters, running to shelter. Single missile that was fired at central Israel. So that ceasefire does not apply to the Houthis in Yemen, but they are unquestionably an Iranian proxy. They receive their weapons from Iran. At times, they've received training from Iran. This not only comes from Israeli intelligence, this comes from just about every Western intelligence agency in the world as well. That Iran is backing the Houthis in Yemen, the same way that they've backed Hezbollah, the same way that they've backed these militia groups that are operating out of Iraq and Syria, the same way that they've backed groups that are operating out of the West Bank. Whatever, I mean, it is the position of most every Western nation that just about every group that is operating in this region that is creating unrest and instability, all roads lead back to Tehran. So this ceasefire does not apply to any of those groups there. That's what you saw yesterday with this attack carried out by the Houthis. I mean, technically as well, I mean, Hamas is a proxy of Iran as well. There isn't a ceasefire in place there. So Iran still has the ability to disrupt, to carry out attacks through their other mechanisms, namely their militias and their proxies that are operating around the region here. So that's another element to all of this as well. The final part of your question, which is another really good one, is, how can Israel fight multiple wars at once here? It is the Israeli perspective, actually, that they've been doing that for years on end, that they are simultaneously fighting a war that has a front in Gaza, a front in the West Bank, a front in Lebanon, a front in Syria, a front in Iraq, a front in Iran, and a front in Yemen. I mean, you'll hear a lot of Israeli political commentators talk about this seven-front war that is currently ongoing here. And even further than that, there are many here who believe that October 7th wasn't necessarily the start of a war. It was just a continuation or another form of a broader war that has been ongoing for decades with Iran that has taken many different positions here. So the question you're asking is a really, really good one. And like in order to understand that, I mean, you really have to unpack Israeli perspective and culture here, which really believes that this is not something that began on October 7th, not something that will likely end with a ceasefire deal in Gaza, something that will not end with a ceasefire, even if it holds for an eternity with Iran. These are all separate conflicts on paper, but all really a continuation of the same conflict, the same war that has been ongoing for decades. So that is the way that I would try and paraphrase the Israeli perspective on all of this here. See, we got a few more questions that are coming in here now. Hey, here's a new one that just came in on Trump's push for Netanyahu's legal troubles to take a back seat. How does the public feel? That's another good question that is here. It just goes to show. I think sometimes in the United States we have a bad habit of viewing the political dynamics of other countries, very much so from the surface level, and thinking all political conversations focus around one issue, that they all focus around the war that is taking place here. As we were saying before, on October 6th, 2023, there were major political conversations that were taking place in Israel over the judicial system and the judicial reforms here in Israel. Debates that have not been concluded and conversations that are still ongoing here in Israel. And then you look at as you pointed out, the legal troubles that Prime Minister Netanyahu is having. Similar to the United States, there are coalitions here in Israel who vehemently and wholeheartedly will back Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu until the end. Those coalitions are still very much so existent and still very robust in Israel, who believe that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is not only their preferred candidate, but the only person who can lead Israel forward, the only person who is tested in war and can lead the country through the tumultuous times that it is seeing right now. There are others who believe that the time for change has been here for a long time, that Prime Minister Netanyahu should have been replaced a long time ago, and that there should be new, fresh leadership in Jerusalem. It seems as though that a lot of these conversations about the legal troubles that Prime Minister Netanyahu is in kind of revolve around the political lines of where people broadly view Prime Minister Netanyahu as a whole. Similarly to how people largely felt about the legal troubles that President Trump was in ahead of this election. The 4 cases. There are some people, if you were a through and through unabashed supporter of President Trump, largely you probably felt as though that all of the court cases that the legal system was pursuing against President Trump were weak, were politically motivated, and should not have been brought. And if you were someone who really did not like President Trump, you probably thought that the legal cases that were being brought against him were true, earnest, noble, and all about justice and accountability. Those same divides over the legal cases involving President Trump, I would say, are in very similar breadth here in Israel. I mean, it really just comes down to the political dynamic that is ongoing here. So that's a really good question. Let's take a look here. So this is an interesting one here. Why won't Turkey help Israel? That is a really good question. Um, so Turkey is a NATO member state, a part of this alliance with the West, this alliance that includes the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Poland, all of these other countries that are here. NATO is, largely de facto, this prime ally of Israel. Um, at whatever level you want to put it in, whether it's at the NATO level or whether it's the individual sovereign state level. The United States is a close ally of Israel. The British are close allies of Israel. The French are close allies of Israel. And there's been a lot of rhetoric back and forth between some of these countries in recent days, which would make some people in Israel question how tight those alliances are. But from purely the political alliance standpoint at a 20,000-foot view, they are close allies. Turkey has a different view on the situation that is here right now. The United States has named Hamas a foreign terrorist organization. Turkey views Hamas as a political movement and a political party. Two very fundamentally different views of what Hamas is, of what October 7th was, of what the war is as it is ongoing, what it has been like over the last few months. So that is where Turkey breaks from many of its Western allies. So on paper, Turkey should be in lockstep with the United States and the United Kingdom and France and Germany, rhetorically speaking, but they are not. They view all of this very differently. They have been one of those countries that has been very outspoken about the situation that is in Gaza. Um, Turkey continues to maintain relations, with some of these groups. Again, I mean, viewing Hamas as a political organization as opposed to a terrorist organization it could not be more night and day from the United States. So that's why Turkey and their leadership has had some very choice words for Israel. Has been strongly critical of the Israeli leadership, and you have seen that play out again and again. Harsh rhetoric coming from Turkey towards Israel in the way that they've conducted this war, and that's why Turkey has been one of the more outspoken opponents of Israel, really, despite the fact that they're part of the NATO alliance and the part of the fact that they should be in keeping with many of these other Western states. They've largely not been. So that's where you see one of the breaks there, and that's Turkey's perspective on this whole situation. Let's take a look here. What else we got here?
Robert, I was wondering if you could talk about the mood on the ground now in summer versus when you first started reporting there back in October of 2024.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, things have changed. I mean, it is amazing, how much the sentiments here really ebb and flow rather quickly. So I first got into Israel on October 8th, 2023. And there was so much uncertainty on the ground. I mean, still, the wounds were so deep from what had happened on October 7th. I mean, everywhere you would go, um, people were scared, businesses were closed, people were sobbing. There were a lot of rocket attacks that were coming up this way towards Tel Aviv. Um, and it, it was truly the equivalent. October 8th, 2023 was the equivalent of September 12th, 2001. I mean, just imagine the landscape of the United States at that time. and the shock and the uncertainty and just not even knowing, if the sun would rise the next day. That was the feeling that was on the ground here, that many of us Americans can probably empathize with in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. Then you would start to see things start to come back. You would start to see businesses reopening, as a lot of Hamas's capabilities started to diminish and the rocket attacks started to fall, started to see the city come back to life a little bit. But then when we got back here, right at the breakout of war with Iran, it was as if we had gone all the way back to October 8th again. In fact, perhaps even worse, because there was this widespread recognition of Iran's capabilities that really made the capabilities of Hamas or the Houthis or even Hezbollah, really pale in comparison. Iran had these highly advanced ballistic missiles, and the evidence of that was being seen every day in the way that the Iron Dome defense systems, while effective, were significantly less effective than we had ever seen them before. I mean, there are still missile damage just a couple blocks away from where we are right now. You weren't really seeing these massive impact sites at the beginning of the war with Hamas, but you were seeing a lot of missile strikes here in Tel Aviv by comparison over the last couple of weeks. Now that the war with Iran has ended, it has been a quick snap here in Israel. A lot of businesses immediately came back. People are back out on the beaches. The beaches were packed here over the last couple of days. Restaurants were packed. Cafes were packed. There's been a total shift in focus away from Iran and the threats coming from Tehran, now back to Gaza. And even more so, the sentiment has changed because there really does seem to be a widely and deeply felt belief here that something is coming in the next couple of days, that there is going to be some kind of movement on Gaza, whether it's a ceasefire, whether it's a total cessation of war, whatever it ends up being. There is this belief here that is on the ground that we're all going to be living in a very different world here in a week or so. And that is cause for optimism here in Israel. That is cause for optimism that hostages are going to come home. That is cause for optimism that loved ones who are in Gaza fighting in the IDF are going to come home. Because keep in mind, this is a country of 10 million people. Everyone in this country knows someone who was killed, taken hostage on October 7th, or is fighting in Gaza today. Everyone knows someone who's been impacted by this war directly. That's why there's so much optimism here. Then there's a bigger picture, that I kind of want you to take away from this, which is why I think this is such a monumental moment in time. There is very clearly an effort being made behind the scenes to take this moment in time, to take this potential precipice of a ceasefire deal in Gaza and expand it into a broader parlance of peace in the region. One of the countries that you're looking at right now is Syria. The Trump administration just lifted all these sanctions on Syria in the last couple of days here. The president was asked about it yesterday, said he wants to give Syria a chance, an opportunity to rebuild. There is a belief here that we might be on the precipice of some of these countries, Lebanon, Syria, Saudi Arabia, entering into Abraham Accords 2.0 and opening up diplomatic ties with Israel. Something that was inconceivable just a couple of months ago. Something that seemed impossible, at the time of October 7th, that we'd never see a world in which Lebanon would open up these diplomatic ties with Israel because Hezbollah had too much control there, or that the Assad regime in Syria would ever open up diplomatic ties with Israel. Well, now the Assad regime has fallen in Syria. Now we live in a completely different world. It just feels as though that everything is on the verge of changing. And there is very clearly this hope that a ceasefire deal in Gaza is close. And if it is close, a ceasefire deal can lead to a long-term peace solution between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And a long-term peace solution between the Israelis and the Palestinians can be brokered into a situation in which maybe Saudi Arabia opened up diplomatic ties with Israel, because they have said very publicly that they're not in a position to open up diplomatic ties with Israel until the Palestinian situation is dealt with. Or maybe Syria, or maybe Lebanon, maybe Qatar, or any of these other countries that are here in the region. We just don't know what's going to happen over the coming days and weeks here, but it does feel as though that we're living in this very unique moment here in the Middle East, that the landscape here may be shaped drastically, potentially for decades, if not forever. So that's why I say it's such an important moment in order to watch what is happening here. I don't know what's going to happen. And I have to tell you that it's, historically pretty bad business in order to predict what's going to happen here in this region here, because it is so historically unpredictable. But it does just feel as though that we are living in a unique moment in time here. This is a really good question here. How do parents tell their kids why they go into a bomb shelter, etc.? It is such a part of the day-to-day life here, that you see it just normalized in so many cases. I mean, you have kids who are playing board games, by candlelight in the bomb shelter, or, bringing their like video games with them, or bringing books with them, to ride out these attacks. It's like, I mean, this might be the best parallel that I can come up with. Like how in the United States there are like hurricane parties, that people have. There are people here who, you know, will do things like that, in the bomb shelters, that will like play board games, or try and make the most of the situation here, and ride it out. It is so ingrained in culture. Where I, it's a really good question. Where I personally found that was most different was when I was in Ukraine. And I remember doing this interview with a woman who was in her and from the town of Kherson. And this was right when the city of Kherson, Ukraine, was invaded by the Russians, and it had fallen just a couple of weeks into the war. And her family had to pack up everything that they had and flee southern Ukraine, and then went to Ivano-Frankivsk in order to take shelter. And I asked that question to that woman. It's like, how do you tell, her 4-year-old little girl who's so innocent, how do you tell her? How do you explain this whole situation to her? And the answer that she gave was, we tell them that orcs and goblins are invading our town, and we have to pick up and leave. And I was so struck by that, orcs and goblins, like something out of mythology, something out of movies or video games, or like Harry Potter TV shows or something like that. How do you explain war to a child? I don't have a good answer to that. And I'm grateful that I've never really had to do that myself personally. Um, but sometimes, when we talk about wars here, we get very sucked into the politics of what is right, what is wrong, who's on the right side of history, who is on the wrong side of history. We talk about the presidents and the prime ministers, and the parliaments and the senates. We talk about the people who make the decisions, to send people into war. What we oftentimes forget are the everyday people who are caught in the middle of this, in this situation, in Israel, in Gaza, in Ukraine, in any of these countries in which you have seen conflict breaking out. And these everyday people who did not choose war, but had a war thrust upon them, and have to have those conversations with their children, or have to have those conversations with their loved ones. Those are the things that we sometimes forget about the most, is that while wars are so inherently, from a 40,000 foot view, political. They're done for political reasons. Pick a reason, behind a war. It's those everyday people who are caught in the middle of all of this. And when you stand on the ground in some of these places and you meet some of the people who are caught in the middle of that, it reminds you, of who is at the forefront of these wars here and who suffers the most. And I think that that's the important thing to remember with all this is that it's humans. It's not politics. It's not political movements. It's humans that are at the heart of all of this. I think that's a really good question, a really humanizing question that you asked. And I really appreciate you asking that.
And Robert, I think that is a great place to end.
Yeah, it looks as though we've gone on for an hour here, but some really, really excellent questions that so many of you have asked here. And I really appreciate the interest. We're going to continue to do this here because, again, I think that there's going to be a lot of movement that happens here in the Middle East in the coming days, in the coming weeks. If we're having this conversation again next week, we might be living in a completely different world. But thank you so much for tuning in. You're welcome to follow me on all my social media platforms at Robert Sherman TV. I also have a newsletter that I send out on an as-needed basis, usually a couple of times a week, my Frontlines newsletter, which I share a lot of these perspectives that we're seeing, hearing, feeling on the ground here, and anything that I could share with you. And if you have any questions that I wasn't able to get to, you're welcome to email me, send them to me through any of my social media platforms. But thank you very much. And looking forward to chatting with you again soon.